great pleasure to introduce my professor, Chris Rowe, Professor of Psychology at the University of Northampton. Chris is one of these people who works at the interface, I'd like to say, between parapsychology and transpersonal psychology, something I'm particularly interested in. He has interests in both areas and generally in the area of anomalous experience. He's a board member of the Parapsychological Association. He's also one of the officers of the Transpersonal Psychology section. He's the editor of the Journal of the Society for Psychical Research and is known to many of you here as the program leader, course leader for the MSc at Northampton in Consciousness Studies and Transpersonal Psychology. And he supervises young PhD students in those areas. So he's going to talk to us today about precognition.
Which door would you prefer? The back? Can we open the door at the back? Just to keep it, yeah, nice and cool. Haven't even started yet. I thought I had a question already. It would be precognition. We're very well. I thought it was very interesting this morning. I think it was Elliot mentioned the notion of hard science and soft approaches to science, and very often that's characterised as a difference between those disciplines that work with insentient matter and those of us that work with living systems. And in areas like psychology, there's a bit of snootiness about the idea of the degree of control and certainty you can have over situations and outcomes. And we're quite comfortable, certainly we saw this morning, with the idea that at times it's worthwhile sacrificing those features for the rewards that are available to us in terms of the greater richness that we can capture and the meaningfulness that we can attach to the kinds of experiences that people report that very often is lost when we simply have simple, hard science, quantitative data collection and reporting. Having said that, I think there is still some value in adopting at times a more, quote, scientific approach, one that's recognisable to the mainstream as the way in which they do their business, so that we can make, hopefully, the claims that we're presenting and the outcomes that we're reporting more palatable to them. And certainly, coming from a background in parapsychology, I'm very much of the view that there is nothing particular about anomalous experiences that leaves them outside the domain of those conventional approaches. We may not learn as much about the depth and richness, the personal meaning of those experiences, but I think we can offer something instead in terms of verifying that these experiences are pretty much as people think they are. They are as they are described, that we can verify that they occur and they have some degree of replicability. And so I think that's one of the key things to get across is this idea that parapsychology has a collection of methods by which we can capture some of the phenomena that hopefully are interesting to you as transpersonal psychologists. However, given the topic of the conference this year, I thought it wouldn't be terribly useful simply, as I've done before, to introduce you to a particular paradigm in parapsychology and let you know something about the outcomes from that approach. And instead, what I thought I would do here is take a slightly different perspective and give you some kind of insight into how others have reacted to particular claims being made by one person, in particular Daryl Bem, based on some of his research, to get a sense of how science might actually work in practice rather than how it might be described in textbooks. I wanted to start by giving you a bit of background to Daryl because it's important to know about his reputation, his history, his competencies and his esteem within mainstream psychology. Daryl Bem trained as a social psychologist at the University of Michigan, and throughout his professional career he's been at top tier universities in the US. For example, Stanford and Harvard are two of the 8 Ivy League universities, and Harvard and Cornell's where it's mainly been, are in the top 6 of the Times highest world ranking universities. And in the Times Higher they report that the top 6 are head and shoulders above the rest. So Bem has certainly inhabited rather rarefied atmospheres. He's surrounded by colleagues who are working at very high levels, who are very well regarded, and clearly is himself having to compete at that level as well. He's produced a track record of very well regarded research in a number of different areas, which at times we would hope might translate into assumptions about his competencies when it comes to these rather unusual claims that he's been making, mainly since he became emeritus in 2007. He's been more invested in parapsychology and more involved in the field since then. His reputation is partly built on a couple of contributions to social psychology. He's responsible for the self-perception theory. I can tell you about that later, which is a common feature of social psychology textbooks, and also a theory of sexual orientation that also is based on the idea of self-perception, looking at how one responds and how one compares oneself to other people. Importantly, he's a co-author of Hildgaard and Atkinson, which is the classic undergraduate textbook for psychology that's pretty much subscribed to by most universities in the States, and it's a pretty high esteem indicator that he was invited to join that author team. In terms of parapsychology, he becomes interesting to us when we learn that he's actually always had an interest in magic, sleight of hand, and has been a long-standing member of the Association for Psychic Entertainers. This became relevant because at a time when Charles Honorton, who's one of the main figures in parapsychology, was doing a lot of research on ESP and getting really quite interesting results. People seem to be doing much better than we might expect just by chance, but he wanted to be sure that there was no way they might be cheating in those experiments. He called upon Darrell to come in and take a look at the setup, the system, and see if there were any ways in which an expert magician might be able to overcome the controls that were in place. Could there be ways to simulate psychic effects under those experimental conditions? Ben turned out to be very impressed with the conditions and ultimately ended up co-authoring a paper that describes some of Chuck Honorton's work. The deal that was made was that he was very, very happy with the conditions, and if Chuck were able to replicate the findings in a new batch of studies that were just about to be started, then he would make sure that it was published in the top-tier psychological journal. And good as his word, when those data did confirm that pattern, people seem to be doing much better than they should be by chance. They managed to get that published in the Psychological Bulletin, which is one of the few flagship journals of the APA, the American Psychological Association. The problem with Ganzfeld is, more recently I've seen critics still describe it this way, it is rather arcane or mysterious in the pejorative sense. It involves dressing people up in peculiar ways, putting eye shields on their eyes, bathing them in red light, putting them in warm, comfy chairs, those kinds of things. And it doesn't look especially normal or ordinary. It looks as if there's maybe some kind of trick at work here. So Ben, after being involved with Honorton in that earlier work, wanted to strike out on his own and come up with a new design of experiment, one that was actually a little bit more attractive to the mainstream. Something that would be recognisable to other psychologists as a very straightforward, very clean psychological experiment. He described this in some of his early work as the Holy Grail. And this was a straightforward, transparent laboratory demonstration of psi that could be replicated by any competent experimenter. Thus, when you read a report, say by them or somebody else from parapsychology, that says, in this study we found evidence for ESP, you don't need to take their word for it. Instead, you can adopt the methodology. It would be straightforward for you to take it to your lab, get one of your research assistants to conduct a study for yourself, and because the phenomena are robust, hopefully with this Holy Grail, you'll find similar findings, and so that's the way that you'll become persuaded that something is going on. In this respect, I like to think that Ben isn't really much different from what J.D. Ryan was attempting to achieve in the 1930s, when again with his card-guessing techniques, he was trying to recruit other psychologists rather than speak to the general public about the occurrence of ESP. But a second feature of Ben's approach, which was particularly clever, was the idea that what he wanted to do was to take a well-established protocol or method, one that had a strong track record of success in a rather mundane or conventional area of psychology, give it a twist in some way so that it now spoke to the parapsychology claim, such that if he still found that it provided evidence for, in this case, precognition, it couldn't then be criticised on methodological grounds. Because the methods, if they're weak here, if they're flawed in some way here, then that weakness would also apply to that very large database that had been generally accepted by psychologists over the last 10 or 20 years. So that's at the heart of what Ben was trying to do. We'll see in a second whether he was successful in that. So one example of this is there's a large mainstream literature on something called the mere exposure effect. And this simply states that the more that we're exposed to a stimulus, the more we'll like it, even when it's neutral. And this is why when you're walking down the aisle at Morrison's and you see two boxes of cornflakes, you're more likely to pick the Kellogg's cornflakes than the other, because you've had repeated exposure to the Kellogg's logo and the particular shape of their boxes, and it just seems more likeable in some subtle, unspecifiable way. Now the example I'm just about to show you involves spiders. I warn you in case you have a phobia of spiders and you can look away now. But this is the kind of classic example that Ben would give. If you present in a standard mere exposure study a participant with a picture of a spider, is quite horrible. It elicits arousal in the person, and they associate that with a fearful or dislike affect or emotional response. However, if you repeatedly expose the person to that picture of that spider, what happens is that their arousal level actually decreases. They don't respond as strongly as they did in that first exposure. And continual exposure in that way ultimately leads to you not having the same kind of aversive reaction to the spider. Thus, later on, if you present participants with 2 pictures of spiders and ask them which of these do you like the best, or which do you dislike the least, they'll tend to pick the one that they've been exposed to before. And this is pretty much, if we follow this back in evolutionary time, this reflects the idea that if you're walking through a forest somewhere and you see this big hairy spider you've never seen before, the right and proper response is to be frightened to death by it and keep a good distance from it. However, if each day subsequently you follow the same path and that spider's still there and nothing bad happens to you, it actually would be dysfunctional for you to respond as strongly each and every time you come across it. So it kind of makes sense evolutionarily that might happen. And the power of this original effect is that the original presentation can be really quite degraded. You can present the stimuli very rapidly so people have no conscious sense of having seen the picture, and nevertheless they will still go on to prefer the exposed picture, even though they've got no conscious recollection of it. So that's the standard effect, and there's no dispute or controversy about the mere exposure effect. All that Ben did was turn it into a precognition task by reversing the elements, the sequence of them. So in his study, what he would do is present a participant with 2 pictures of spiders, and they're not being asked to be psychic. Don't use your ESP to work out which is a target. Simply look at those 2 pictures and which one do you like the best. You pick which one you pick, and then the computer randomly selects one of them and exposes you to it. Now clearly, this exposure happens in your future. There's no way at all that it can affect your judgment in the original liking task. The problem is that it does seem to. People, even in this version of the task, do tend to prefer the to-be-exposed picture over the one that they won't see in their future. It's as if their future experience impacts on, it affects their judgment now. And seems to be a form of, a characterisation of precognition. Ben found a number of different protocols that had that basic feature. So take a standard effect, put a bit of a time reversal in a couple of the elements, and then see if an effect still occurs that might be indicative of precognition. And he ended up publishing 9 experiments that used 5 different paradigms of that sort. And across these 9 experiments, 8 were independently significant. As a psychologist, he was interested in internal patterns as well, and he picked up on one particular individual differences variable, which is people's responsiveness to horrible pictures like the ones I just showed you, and he called that sensation seeking, and again found that those people who were most responsive were the ones who showed the largest effect. He chose, again, to publish this in a flagship journal. He boasts that he's always had his papers published in the first journal to which he sent papers, something I don't think anyone else can probably claim. And he chose to publish this in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, which is, again, top-tier APA journal, and went through a very rigorous review process. The JPSP rejects around about 82% of submissions that it receives, so the likelihood of getting published is very low, and they clearly have access to the whole range of experts in various domains, and this paper in particular was sent out to people working in those mainstream areas so that they could judge whether he'd actually adapted the protocol appropriately. Nevertheless, having been vetted by 2 editors and 4 reviews, they decided to publish, and it appeared in 2011. So far so good. What we have then is an academic who spent his life at top-tier universities. He's publishing in a top-tier journal whose scrutiny is incredibly close and tight, and he seems to have come up with a robust set of studies that use standard practices in conventional psychology, but are identifying an anomaly that presumably should be of interest to other psychologists. So what was the reaction? Well, here's the reaction from... Oh, I thought I was going to give you the reaction next. Sorry, I'm going to illustrate 2 more of the experiments, so I'll do that. And then we'll see the reaction. That's just to build up a bit of tension. What the reaction actually was. Yes, you did know that. So here are a couple of the other examples, and these, if anything, are a little bit more puzzling, to be honest. The priming task, again, is a very standard effect in psychology, and I'll show you in a second how this works. Basically, it involves getting you to respond to pictures and make quick judgments as to whether that picture is pleasant or unpleasant. And you have two buttons that you can press. You press this button if you think the picture's pleasant, and this button if you think it's unpleasant. Okay? And the way it would ordinarily work is that you'd have some kind of a mask, so you can't kind of rely on the sensory impression of the last image that won't get in the way of the task. You then have a marker, a fixation point, and you stare at that fixation point, and you're ready with your two buttons, ready to respond as quickly but accurately as possible. But then you're presented with a prime very rapidly, and the prime is a value-laden word that might be positive or negative, and that's flashed up to you, sometimes again subliminally, before you're given the image to look at. On some occasions, the prime is a mismatch with the correct response. So nauseating probably isn't the right response for a lovely picture of some flowers like that. On other occasions, there's a match between the two. So the word might be positive and the picture that follows is also positive. In the standard priming situation, what we find is that where there's a match between the prime and the correct response, your reaction times are quicker than if there's a mismatch. So it's a fairly standard, again, very robust effect. It's as if you're being distracted by this initial stimulus, even if you've got no conscious awareness of what the original word was. So that's the standard psychological effect. Then, gave people the mask, then the fixation point, but then they had to give their judgment. Is that a horrible picture or a nice picture? Well, it's quite horrible. And then the prime would appear afterwards. Again, too late to have any impact on your reaction times. It doesn't provide information that's available at the time of your judgment. The other task, which is slightly even more bonkers, is facilitation of recall effect. And the basic idea here is that people will find stimuli, such as words, more memorable if you give them a task where they have to work with those words in a more deep, richer way. Some way that processes the meaning of those words, draws associations or connections between them. If people work with material, they'll remember more of it later. In that way, that's why we encourage at university students to engage in deeper learning rather than superficial learning. Looking over your lecture notes is not a good way to try and revise. Trying to do something with that material and make sense of it, appropriate it in your own terms, is much better. That's a standard kind of situation. But here, Ben provided his participants with 48 words flashed on screen, one after another, that they knew they were to attempt to memorise. So they have words like gorilla, bread, comedian, and so on. Then he gave them a memory task. And in the memory task, after a short break, they simply had to type out as many of those words as they could remember from that long list of 48. Typically, people remember about 50% of the words. After we've collected their recall data, so after they've completed the memory task, we then give them an opportunity to practice something. Seems a bit pointless, they've already done the memory task. The computer randomly selects half of the 48 words and has the participant work with those materials to build up that meaning-making sense, the connection between them. So here, for example, click on the 6 words in that set that are to do with food. So we've got bread and turnip and oatmeal and soup. And it'll go on with the other stimulus words as well that are in the target group. So you're working with that material, but it's too late for it to have an impact on your recall performance, we think. Here are the results, though. And what we found, as I mentioned before from Ben's work, is that across the 9 experiments, 8 of them were independently significant. So they gave evidence that suggests that people are doing better than they should do just by chance, as if they were acquiring information that only existed in their future. The stimulus-seeking effects over here show that people who score higher on stimulus-seeking tended to do better than people who were low, and the exceptions we replicated at Northampton is with low stimulus seekers for prime. Okay, so the build-up then, what was the reaction that we mentioned before? And this is, as I say, from the New York Times. It's craziness, pure craziness. I can't believe a major journal is allowing this work in. I'm an emeritus professor of psychology at the University of Oregon and a long-time critic. I think it's just an embarrassment to the entire field. And certainly in that first wave of reaction, the main response seems to be that this has been a damning injury to the JPSP and to the APA more generally. What on earth were these reviewers thinking of to let this kind of a paper through? It's quite embarrassing for psychology as a discipline that we seem to be condoning these kinds of phenomena. Also, Wagenmaker, whose name will come up a little bit later, noted that perhaps there's social reasons why this might have been published by the JPSP. Maybe they were looking to publicise the journal, have more of a media splash, and that maybe what was going on here is that they were simply reporting a hypothesis that's counterintuitive and attention-grabbing. But what we need to bear in mind is, when we come to review papers like this that make these kinds of claims, we need to apply a higher level of scrutiny, a higher level of scepticism, because such a hypothesis probably constitutes an extraordinary claim. And of course, as the mantra goes, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. One of the reactions was among various science blogs that exist on the internet, and again the response was fairly mixed but tended to be quite sceptical. One interesting account comes from Pascal Esponse, who reported having spoken to academic colleagues. So these are usually written by academics, but for public dissemination. And Pascal here wrote, "After speaking to quite a few of my colleagues about this, I realised that the willingness to take these results seriously, as opposed to dismissing them out of hand, which again was quite a common response, is a function of the prior probability that the effects exist. If this is true for science in general, and it is true for people in general, then we're in big trouble. The data are the data. That is what all we have to go by. That and the way the data are collected and how they connect to the claims. That's the way the referees would have worked. We might not like the implications or the conclusions that are drawn based on the evidence, but all we can do is look at the formal process. How were these data gathered? Were those methods adequate? What are the data telling us? Were they analysed appropriately? What conclusions are drawn, and are they reasonable given the data?" That's as far as we go, without necessarily thinking, but my God, if we say yes to all these are going to be the implications. That isn't really the remit of the refereeing process. So people were bugged by the result, not the methodology. That's my emphasis. As a matter of fact, the experimental approach would have passed muster in most fields, including psychology, without second thought, if the results had been more in line with expectations. No one would have batted an eye. No one would have attempted a replication. This would have given those with a concern for the state of the field pause for thought. How many results that are out there are wrong? How many results that are wrong do we believe because we expect them to be true? So our background priors seem to be determining whether we're willing to accept new claims, not the quality of the evidence or the manner in which the evidence has been collected. Okay, well, is it reasonable for people to use their priors when they're making these kinds of judgments? There is an analytic process that allows you to take your prior predisposition into account, and it's using a form of analysis called Bayesian analysis. I'm certainly no statistician, so please no questions about the mathematics behind this. But essentially, it allows you to specify your prior belief or judgment about the likelihood of a phenomenon or claim being true, the null hypothesis being false, and to build that into the way in which you analyse new data. Wagenmakers and some colleagues published in the JPSP a rebuttal to the original Benn paper that took a Bayesian analysis approach. They decided to set their prior at 99 million to 1 against the occurrence of ESP. So 99 trillion to 1. When they built that into their analysis, they found that overall, even given Benn's data, the overall likelihood of the outcomes being just huge chance is well within chance expectation. There's nothing going on here, move along please. There's nothing we need to worry about. Unfortunately, for Wagenmakers and colleagues, one of the key workers in parapsychology, Jessica Utz, and her partner, Wes Johnson, are experts in Bayesian analysis. And in fact, in their original paper, they cited a couple of authoritative papers by Johnson in terms of offering a rationale for their approach. Johnson, Lutz and Darrell Benn got together to produce a second analysis and demonstrated quite convincingly that there are a number of assumptions that are made in conducting a Bayesian analysis, and one involves the likely effect size we might expect if the null hypothesis were false. And that actually in psychology, those effect sizes should normally be in the range from about 0.1 to about 0.3 or 0.35, and that Wagenmakers and colleagues had used a ridiculously inflated figure that we never find in psychological literature. And that actually, if we conduct our Bayesian analysis appropriately, even when our prior is still set astronomically low, we suddenly get a significance that is still suggesting something is going on, that we can't simply account for this in terms of chance variation. It looks as if people are doing much better than they should be able to. So of course now that the wider community has accepted that Benn and colleagues have rebutted this critique. Of course not. I thought I had it at the end there. Yeah, there's one particular response with that from Stuart Ritchie, maybe I'll come to that later. One of the other critiques that appeared is again from an old friend of parapsychology, from James Alcock, and he had some specific methodological concerns that he raised, and we'll consider these in a little bit of detail. One of the problems with this kind of approach is, however, that sceptical commentaries on parapsychological research tend to work mainly in terms of insinuation, so vague suggestions that something somewhere is wrong, and quite often fail to be able to specify where exactly the problem is. It's almost as if, well, this maybe could have been done slightly better, and this bit is maybe not quite optimal, and none of these could account for the phenomenon. We're not claiming that, but nevertheless, as a whole, things seem to be a little bit not quite right. I won't mention any names in particular because this is being recorded and might end up on the internet, but there are one or two people familiar to you who tend to adopt that kind of approach. Some of the specific methodological critiques actually don't apply terribly well, and we'll take a couple of examples of them. There are problems with the idea of multiple analysis. So every time we conduct an analysis, what we're doing is saying we're comparing the likelihood of this outcome given the null hypothesis. Okay. However, the more analyses we do, the more we inflate the likelihood that in our net that we're casting, we're going to by accident catch a chance effect, one that isn't reflective of the real effect, but is just an anomaly, just something that occurred by chance. So, in standard psychology, for example, we take a p-value of 0.05 or 120, and that literally means if there's nothing going on, if the null hypothesis were true, and we conducted the same experiment 20 times, one of those experiments would report a significant outcome. Because that's what it means. Just by chance, 1 in 20 of these studies would report a significant outcome. But equally, if one experiment conducts 20 analyses that are independent, then one of those analyses will be significant just by chance, not suggestive of any underlying effect. And the problem for us is, when we have something like a correlation matrix, we've no idea among all those different correlations which might be chance correlations and which might actually be really interesting. So it's quite a problem. So Alcock decided to challenge Ben on the grounds of using multiple analyses. He picked on one in particular, which is that Ben used both parametric and non-parametric analyses. The problem with that is that Ben did that because skeptics would criticise the study if he made the wrong kinds of assumptions about the analyses he was doing, and so he presented the parametric version to say, this is the analysis as we do it, but for interest, here's what would have happened if we did it the other way, and you can see we get the same result. So it's not an opportunity to capitalise on chance by doing lots of things and hoping that something comes out, but it's simply confirming with one method what we see from another method. And secondly, there are a couple of occasions when Ben uses multiple analyses, but these are mainly to confirm failures to find significance. But actually in some situations, particularly among males, and particularly for non-erotic targets, as we'll see in a minute, we won't see the targets, I'm afraid, but in those situations, nothing happens. People don't respond to those in the way that they do to the more interesting stimuli and the more interested people. And in that situation, it shouldn't matter that all of these studies are showing nothing. There's nothing to capitalise on because they're all showing the same thing. There's also down at the bottom something which I think is more important, which is a concern about a negative definition. It is the case in psychology that very often we attribute outcomes to psi as a kind of a place marker when we've ruled out all explanations that we're already familiar with. So in a sense, we haven't really explained anything. All we've said is we've tried to be exhaustive in describing all the normal ways this outcome might have occurred, and none of those seem satisfactory, so we're still left with something that's going on. And the problem with that is, of course, you may not know all of the normal ways that something could be achieved, and there may be others still that lie in our future that we will discover. So Ben responded to Alcock, and I think quite thoroughly, really, and damningly, by saying, indeed, Alcock is right in saying that it's illegitimate and misleading to perform multiple tests on a set of data without adjusting the significance levels. This is well known to experimental psychologists, but in fact it doesn't apply to any of the analyses in my article. Alcock has memorised the right words about multiple tests, but doesn't appear to understand the logic behind those words. Perhaps Alcock wants me to change my conclusion that there are no significant effects on non-erotic pictures to the conclusion that there really are no significant effects in non-erotic pictures. And yet, Ritchie and colleagues still cite the Wagenmakers as demonstrating that there are problems with the form of analysis, that a Bayesian approach shows that there's no effect, and also in their review talk about Alcock having outlined numerous experimental flaws in the design, insinuation rather than specifiable fact. Now, one of the main events in this story is the attempt by Stuart Ritchie, Chris French and Richard Wiseman to conduct replications independently at their different bases in the UK, and the story of how they attempted to get those replication attempts published. French and Wiseman are particularly well known as skeptics and have a track record of failing to replicate mainstream parapsychological effects, Stuart Ritchie is a new person in this area. His study was conducted by one of his students and might have been at her suggestion. All of the studies were unsuccessful and 2 were in the wrong direction, so there was a tendency for people to do worse than we might expect by chance, rather than by more chance. The effect of stimulus seeking was mush, really nothing much going on there, except in one case where there was an effect that would have been significantly in the wrong direction. So again, kind of fits with the sceptical outlook. They attempted to publish in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology and were quite rightly rejected because the journal has got very clear publication criteria. They only publish original research, they don't publish replications. And even when they publish original research, they expect it to be a body of research, so a number of studies that speak to the same phenomenon or approach. So quite rightly it was rejected. Wiseman and colleagues squealed foul at that. That was unfair. They were also unable to publish in British Journal of Psychology because they requested that they conduct further studies. The power of the studies that they conducted were quite low. They only had 150 participants in total, and the reviewers asked for more experiments to be conducted. They weren't willing to do that and instead went to the media to describe this plight and complained about the state of replication in psychology. They published in 3 Actus, an open access journal. They were responsible for a special issue of The Psychologist, which focused on the issue of replication. It's founded on their own account of this story of how they attempted to replicate and struggled to be published. Again, this account is kind of peppered with unnecessary value-laden terminology. So they describe outlandish claims in parapsychology, idiosyncratic findings, and their own abject failures to replicate those effects. However, fortunately, this is a very useful document, and you can get this online, the PDF of just this section, the special issue part. There are a number of commentaries that do raise serious issues about the nature of replication in psychology. In particular, the publication bias. It's extremely difficult to get a straight replication published because it's basically saying, it's like the old idea of somebody walking around the town ringing bells saying, all's well, all's well. Well, we kind of know all's well, so we're told again that it's still the same as it was half an hour ago, isn't really telling us anything new. And there's a real sense in psychology that you need something that moves things forward, extends our knowledge base, rather than simply says, remember that other fellow, well, we found the same as him. It's not really much of a news story. So people, therefore, researchers don't tend to conduct straight replications. They tend to do replications with some kind of variation or extension. And that might be an issue because maybe there's some problem with the original publication. Maybe that might be dubious, and maybe what we do need in psychology are more straight replications that simply attempt to confirm the claim, confirm the original findings. Finelli, for example, has found that negative results are disappearing as well. And it might fit in with this idea of journal practice, review processes, where if you attempt to find something and don't find it, well, bad luck really, but there's not really much of a story there for others to pursue, to say, well, we had this interesting hypothesis, but it didn't work out when we looked for it empirically. People don't tend to get those kinds of papers published. But the problem with that kind of approach is, it capitalises then on type 1 error, because it kind of suggests that if there are 100 researchers out there, and particularly if we take the Ritchie situation, if there are 100 academics with students who are conducting projects that are quite interesting, and among those 100 students, 5, just by chance, find a significant outcome. Even when there's nothing really going on, it's only those 5 that are likely to be written up and published. So it's likely then that psychology journals are replete with null findings, but presented as significant, that capitalise on this type 1 error. And in fact, a very nice calculation that's offered by Holcomb and Pashley in that special issue calculates that maybe more than 50% of published psychology articles reflect type 1 error, not real effects. You might argue with some of the parameters, but it's an interesting suggestion. That's fine, and all of this seems to be building up to the notion, well, maybe that's what we're witnessing here. Maybe BEM also is reporting on a type 1 error. It's a more robust, extended database, admittedly, but maybe it's just a lucky shot. And maybe if we look at other people, a wider community, we'll find that actually, no, we would all fail to replicate, and we're just not getting those failings published. But what about type 2? What about situations in which maybe the reverse is true? Well, this is a thought experiment that Jessica Utz offers, and we'll see how we get on with this. It's a bit late in the afternoon, really, for us now, but we'll see how we get on. We've got a situation here where we've got 2 researchers, A and B, and they're each attempting to run an experiment to look for ESP. And the way this ESP experiment works is the participants make a judgment. They look at 4 pictures and they have to say which one of those 4 pictures is their target. So if they were just guessing, they'd be right 25% of the time. Okay? And what's been claimed in the previous study that these are attempting to replicate is that their participants are picking the target more than 25% of the time, and that difference is statistically significant. There's something going on. So researcher A, who's got access to very large samples of undergraduate students to subject to these kinds of experiments, he runs 2 experiments, each with 100 participants, and these are the success rates. 33 were successful in study 1, and 33 and 36 were successful in study 2. With a show of hands, how many people here would believe that researcher A has successfully replicated that ESP effect? Got some hands there. I'm going to get lots of people not from the hand up, I think. How many people now, if we look at researcher B, unfortunately she's got access to fewer students in each cohort, which is that she's a bit more determined and runs lots more experiments. And she runs all of these experiments, so she had a study with 15 participants and the p-values over here. And in the next study she was able to recruit 17, and 6 of those were correct, and so on. With a show of hands, how many people think researcher B was able to replicate the effect? Okay, that's a relief. So I've got very few saying yes before, and I had maybe half a hand for researcher B. In fact, researcher B produced a larger effect size. If we accumulate all of these different trials together, we find that the overall hit rate for her participants was higher than it was for researcher A. The big difference is in terms of study power, the ability to claim that an effect is significantly different from chance. And maybe that's one of the problems that we have in our research, is that many people are attempting these replications with very small effect sizes, and they're simply not running big enough studies to truly capture an effect. That might be responsible for some of these null findings. There's also a problem with sampling error. Even where there's a real effect out there in the real world, we shouldn't expect to be able to replicate it exactly on demand every time we conduct an experiment. So if in this case, we imagine that the observed effect size is here. So in this study, for example, we might be saying that people who are psychic and they're guessing cards, on average get 1.5 cards more than they should be getting just by chance. Okay, correct. On average, obviously, nobody actually gets 1.5. That truly would be paranormal. But of course, when we conduct a number of analyses, a number of different experiments of that effect, what we'll find is that maybe on average, that's the effect size that we see. And in fact, with the larger studies, they're more likely to approximate the real effect size. But there's a lot of error in there as well, measurement error and sampling error, just things that change by chance from session to session, from experiment to experiment, and there'll be a lot of noise down the bottom there. What that means in practice then is, even where we have a real effect, what we might find is, that's the null value, so that's the effect where there's nothing at all going on. Even with a real effect, we'll find 1 or 2 studies that find absolutely no difference. We'll find a number of studies that are a little bit better than chance, but not significantly so. And we'll even find some that do worse than chance. That's in the nature of the beast, that's in the nature of sampling. And that's what we might expect from our database as well. So even so-called non-significant studies might still advance our understanding of the nature and size of an effect. Okay. This relates finally to the notion of how we might understand replication more broadly. And there's a big problem, I think, in psychology generally, with this presumption that we can replicate findings on demand. Because somebody's found an effect and they report a p-value that's highly significant, that gives us great confidence that all we need to do is do what they did and we will find exactly what they found. Statisticians tell us those are unreasonable assumptions to make. So if we take Robert Rosenthal, for example, an authority in these areas, given the levels of statistical power at which we normally operate, we've no right to expect a proportion of significant results that we typically do expect. Even in nature, there's a very real and very important, even if in nature, there's a very real and very important effect. Single failures to replicate are not evidence of a null effect. And Jessica Utz goes on to say, suppose the true probability of a hit is about 0.33. So in our ESP experiment, in fact in the real world, ESP were real, and the way that shows itself is that people get a 33% hit rate instead of a 25% hit rate. And we use the usual criterion 0.05. And what we'd find is that if we had an experiment with 10 trials, the power would be 0.07. What that means is if you run an ESP experiment, and ESP is real, and means that your participants will have, on average, a 33% hit rate instead of chance 25%, you've only got a 7% chance of finding it in your study. Even if you run a study with 50 trials, which is pretty big by Ganzfeld terms, you'll still only got a 1 in 4 chance of your study being significant, even given that the effect is real. We're much more optimistic about the likelihood of capturing significance in our studies than we've got any right to expect. And my final 1 minute, that's that lesson over. My final point then is, what conclusions can we draw about the practice of a scientific approach to the study of anomalous claims? Well, it illustrates that even if we've got very robust methods, even if we've got fairly tight statistical analysis approaches, even if we're people of high esteem who are publishing in top-tier journals, there's still going to be an unwillingness among other scientists to prioritise observations and data over their own prior assumptions. They're human beings first and scientists second. That Ben's assumption that adopting standard methods would protect him from criticism or necessarily imply that those criticisms also apply to the original database, the normal stuff, that was false. People seem very able to treat the parapsychology claims as if they're a special case, without apparently having to justify that. And finally, it exposes naive beliefs about the nature of replication, the idea of replication on demand, for example, and also false beliefs about its practice. Much less replication actually goes on in any other area, never mind contentious claims. Replication simply doesn't occur for the reasons that we mentioned before. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Chris. We started a couple of minutes late, so I think we've probably got time for 1 or 2 questions. One thought that occurred to me is one of the implications of what you're saying that we should only do studies that have a particular statistical power. We shouldn't allow studies to be done if they don't have a certain power to begin with, certain prior power.
No, actually, I think that's a good idea, but I think in practice it's very difficult because they're too expensive, and I don't think people have the will often to keep going with something like a Ganzfeld over 150 or 200 trials. However, I think the key is to adopt a more meta-analytic approach. So not to suddenly have mood swings, so to be elated every time a study comes out that was significant and dejected every time a study comes out that's non-significant. But in fact, it's the accumulation of data across a wide range of studies, even the non-significant ones, that gives us a much clearer sense of what's going on.
But in fact, I understand there have been quite a few other replications, even some on Richard Wiseman's self-appointed replication database, which they didn't mention in their thing, which have given positive results. Can you say a bit about that?
Not very much, because of the 2 that I know of, neither has been published. But one was in the UK, Adrian Ryan, and I've forgotten his name now, but Lancaster. That they've conducted a replication, and there's one on the continent as well. I think, again, if the focus were on individual studies, I think we would miss the point. I mean, the Ryan study I think is very interesting simply because they took Ben's software and actually, whatever the word is, they kind of broke up the code and rewrote the code for themselves to ensure that there were no artifacts or glitches in there, and nevertheless were able to replicate the findings. So I think that's interesting. But I wouldn't want us necessarily still to lay more store against one individual study over another at this stage.
Okay, we'll have to stop there because Liz is treading the boards at the back there. So thank you very much, Chris.